Hello. Over the years, there have been literally hundreds, perhaps even thousands of books released by Games Workshop. Novels and short stories set in the worlds of Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer 40,000, Dark Future, Age of Sigmar, and lots of others besides. There are loads of amazing authors involved in the creation of those awesome stories, both for GW Books back in the late 80s and the Black Library since 1997. But not many authors worked for both of those publishers under Games Workshop. My guest today did, starting at White Dwarf and then becoming a published author for GW Books and then creating one of the most famous and long-running series for the Black Library. Sandy Mitchell, the pen name of Alex Stewart, has been hugely successful with the Ciaphas Cain series of novels, and there are plenty more stories from Sandy available to read as well. Alex and I talk about his career working under the name Sandy Mitchell for Games Workshop, the amazing stories he's told, how he's gone about it, and some of the really fun behind-the-scenes stories. We also touch on his time working at White Dwarf as a film reviewer back in the 80s, and the period he spent working on one of my favourite BBC shows from their Saturday night lineup in the 90s. It's a really fun one. This is a great conversation with lots of interesting, secretive facts from behind the scenes from a lifetime telling stories in the universe of 40k and Warhammer Fantasy. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with the author Alex Stewart, better known as Sandy Mitchell. Alex, thank you so much for joining me. I like to start these conversations just by getting a bit of a history, I suppose, for like how you came into the world of, well, in this case, obviously writing for Games Workshop and creating a lot of that sort of stuff. But I suppose, where did you first start with science fiction and fantasy? What was the beginning of your journey?
Ooh, I think you have to blame my grandmother for that.
Right.
She was a huge fan of science fiction and stuff. She, in fact, one of her favourite anecdotes, sort of way back towards the turn of the last century, she remembers her parents telling her that she was wasting her time reading Jules Verne. It was complete nonsense. Men walking on the moon, never going to happen. And so I think she kind of had that all her life. And of course, by the time I knew her as my nan, she was, never missed an episode of Doctor Who or Thunderbirds, and never missed a Godzilla movie at the local flea pit. And I think I kind of picked up the virus from her.
That's fantastic. Yeah, well, I mean, were you into, was Doctor Who and Godzilla, were those the kind of things that you were enjoying as well then, or did you expand and explore other worlds?
I think so. I would have been about 5 or 6 at the time, so probably Doctor Who and Godzilla were a bit too scary, and I was certainly not allowed into the cinema for that sort of thing. Yeah, I think the first things I can remember watching was stuff like Thunderbirds, Stingray, and then of course we got a colour television, and they were in colour, which was even more amazing. So yeah, I suppose Jerry Anderson was my gateway drug.
Right.
And then of course I discovered written science fiction. All the juvenile classics in the children's section of the local library, sort of Heinlein and Space Cadet, and the James Blish juveniles, Andre Norton, of course, fantastic writer, much underrated these days. And by the time I was about 10, I'd completely gone through all of those about 4 times. And my mum would smuggle out SF books from the adult section for me on her ticket. And most of my pocket money went on SF paperbacks. So I got bitten by the bug at a very early age. And it was about then I realised that someone had actually written these. Um, and, uh, and as you do, you think, oh, I could do better than that. And of course I couldn't. But I actually submitted my first short story to an SF magazine when I was 11.
Wow.
Unsurprisingly, it didn't sell.
That's amazing, though. Yeah, to have the discipline at that age to even finish writing a story, let alone the courage to submit it to someone. That's ace.
Well, yes, I can remember I was about 5 or 6 writing what we would now call Thunderbirds fanfic in large block letters with a crayon. So I just hadn't got it right. I write them in crayon. Nowadays I've got a keyboard.
Am I right that some of your earliest work with Games Workshop was in White Dwarf as a film reviewer? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it probably was. Funny story, it kind of drifted into that because Colin Greenland was taken on as their film critic and did a column or two. And then, as you know, he's a novelist as well, and he had a massive deadline crunch, if I remember rightly, on might have been Take Back Plenty, one of his early books, and basically sort of said, "Would you mind stepping in for me for a couple of issues?" So I did, and I got to see some, actually in retrospect, some pretty cool stuff. I got to the press screening of Aliens.
Wow.
Which was in one of the big cinemas in Leicester Square. And there's a whole bunch of us there. Ken Newman was there, I remember, and a few others. In the spirit of the movie, we went off and ate calamari afterwards. Highlander, I got to see 2 press previews of, because the first time round they showed us the American print by mistake, with basically all the plot and character stuff taken out.
Right.
So I got to see that one twice, and believe me, the UK print is so much better.
I'm a big fan of Highlander. That's fascinating to know that was the US version was that excised because it was dark and too sort of gory or gritty?
No, I mean there was actually a bit more gore in the American print.
Really?
But they'd cut out the entire subplot of Rachel, McLeod's assistant.
Right.
Of him rescuing her as a child.
Sure.
From the Nazis in occupied Europe, and she lives her whole life growing up with him, and into late middle age. That whole dynamic was cut out. That whole subplot.
What a shame. Profound stuff, that.
Yeah, I mean to me that's the emotional core of the movie. And of course they cut the best line in the entire film, because they cut the whole scene where he rescues her, and there's that iconic moment, at least in the British print, where the Nazi officer shoots him, and he just gets up, brushes himself off, and says, "You're the master race, you do that."
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean that's great. That's fascinating. But then it's very interesting then to hear that Kim Newman was there as well. Was it just a cultural thing around that time that authors were also film critics?
Well, Kim was a professional film critic.
Sure.
So that was his day job. I mean, I think I can't remember who he was writing for at the time. Time Out or The Observer.
I think Empire as well. That he was working from very early on, didn't he?
Yeah. Yes. I remember him telling me they sent him to review Spinal Tap because they thought it was a horror movie.
So that, I mean,
Yeah.
and because you did some other stuff as well for White Dwarf during that period, right?
Um, I probably did. Can't really remember.
Right.
Oh, yes, I did. Yes, I did a few freelance articles for. I did a couple of things. Um, did a couple of things on the Fazza's Star Trek role playing game, I think,
Right.
which I was
Yes.
GMing a lot at the time.
Right.
Um, uh, Probably some Traveller stuff, which was my other obsession at the time.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
yeah, never really got into D&D, weirdly, but loved Woofrup. Um, and yeah, because I think the big three things my gaming group was doing at the time was Call of Cthulhu, Star Trek, and Woofrup. So it was obviously, I think the D100 gaming mechanic is something that really sings for me more than
Right.
most other sorts.
That's amazing then. So was it then through the White Dwarf work that you sort of became involved with GW Books, which was that sort of first attempt?
Oddly, no, oddly enough, completely, it was completely separate.
Right.
Because when they started GW Books, one of the first things they did, which is really sensible, they got Dave Pringle in as managing editor. And Dave was the editor of Interzone, which at the time was the only British SF magazine. And I'd sold them a few stories. In fact, I was the first sale they ever took. Small fun fact. And Dave, being really sensible, went, okay, well, I've got this address book with all these really talented writers and me. And he basically sort of got in touch with us all and said, do you want to have a go at doing some Warhammer fiction? And I did. So I thought, okay, it's fun, and got some free gaming materials. Got the Woofrup rulebook and the what was then I think probably the second or third edition of Fantasy Battles.
Right.
Yeah, the last one that came out was a hardback book before they went into doing boxed sets.
Sure. Yeah, the third edition.
Yeah, and first edition 40k Rogue Trader, and yeah, and like everybody else, I thought 40k was just a bit too weird to really get my head around at the time. Ironically, as it turned out, and I was happier with the old world because I fell in love with the RPG instantly. It was such a detailed and interesting world to play around with. Yeah, I sort of just got into that. So I pitched them a short story, which they kind of liked.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Which would be the Tylean rat or the Tylean.
That's the one. Yes.
Yeah. So this was Sam Warble's first appearance.
First
the
appearance.
Halfling PI.
Yes. Which which people seem to like. Yeah, he seemed to resonate with people for some reason, and he sort of ended up as kind of a sort of part of the official background, which was nice. I mean, White. I'm not sure they ever got around to publishing it, but they were working on a Marienberg source book, which they serialized bits of in White Dwarf.
Sure.
And I can't remember if Sam got official stats in there, but certainly a couple of the supporting characters from that story did.
Yeah. Yeah, he did get stats in one of the articles.
Right.
I think it was just in a sort of a dedicated, we're turning Warhammer fiction, GW Books characters into Woofrup PCs. And then, you also had the Marienberg series, which had some other characters and references too.
Yeah. And so and other writers kind of picked up and gave him cameos in their stuff, which was nice.
Yeah.
he gets a little walk on in Beasts in Velvet.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, which actually, I would thoroughly recommend to anybody who hasn't read it. It's that very rare hybrid. It's a fantasy whodunit that plays fair as a mystery and doesn't let the fantasy stuff overwhelm it. So brilliant stuff.
Agreed. Yeah.
I mean, I'd say that was up there with Randall Garrett's Lord Darcy mysteries, if you like that kind of thing.
Right. Fantastic.
Yeah, and yeah, it's actually sort of amusing aside. Steve Baxter did a story with also an investigative character who was an elf in his draft, and they sent it back and said, "Can you use this character instead?" So Sam's second appearance was actually by somebody else entirely.
Right.
Yeah, because they thought that Sam had already been established as as an investigative character, and that was kind of pushing the envelope of what Warhammer was supposed to be anyway. So actually, sort of having the place overrun with detectives wasn't quite.
That's really super interesting. Yeah, because there is a sort of slightly tonal difference between those two stories in the nature of Sam as a character. I mean, I think it roughly works, and you do continue.
Yeah.
It is another investigation in Marienburg, and you're sort of continuing that way. But that's really interesting to hear that that's sort of how that came about. I mean, did you ever have any designs on a sort of sequel yourself and exploring Sam's character more?
Well, I did get to when the Black Library sort of started up. They asked me if I'd do a short story for the Tales of the Old World anthology.
Right.
So Sam is in that, and I did a Warhammer Fantasy trilogy, the Blood on the Reich, and most of the second book in that sequence takes place in Marienburg, and Sam appears in that in a few scenes, interacting with the main protagonists.
Fantastic. That's
great. To be honest, after GW books folded, I thought, well, that's that for him. But I liked the character, so I kind of filed the serial numbers off and sort of rechristened him Pip Summerdew, and he appeared. And under that guise, he appears in the Villains anthology, which Mary Gentle edited, and then a short story I did for Odyssey, which was a fairly short-lived British science fiction magazine. And then again, many years after that, I did a fantasy novel for Bain Books called A Fistful of Elven Gold, and in this he's a gnome called Drago Athelroot, but he is still pretty much the same character. It's basically the same character with a respray and a fresh set of plates.
That's fantastic. I didn't know that there were so many sort of versions, alternative world versions of him floating around. That's awesome. I'm gonna have to seek out some of those now and check them out. Because I think Sam he's still much loved, and he still turns up. He's in even the latest edition of Woofrup. It features him as a character. So it's great to see him still around.
Oh, right. Need to get that. I'm still on second edition.
Sure. Well, I was curious as well about. So he obviously there's an element of the sort of Maltese Falcon built into that initial story.
Yeah.
I believe, and I don't know if you were involved in this at all, so forgive me if I'm going off on a wild goose chase here, but Tony Ackland, one of the artists who was super influential in early Games Workshop, he was working on a Maltese Falcon-based, or is referred to a Maltese Falcon-based scenario for Woofrup that was going to be part of that Marienburg supplement you mentioned, which itself it ended up cancelled because it maybe got a bit too risque. I think it was based in a brothel and maybe sort of wasn't quite right for White Dwarf at that time. I wondered if you were aware of that at the time, or if there was any overlap.
No. I mean, to be honest, you're the first person who's ever mentioned it to me.
Right.
But it would have been quite cool to sort of actually have Sam in an official kind of supplement, even as a walk-on.
Sure. Yeah.
But no, I could see that working. But no, it's not anything they mentioned to me at the time. But then, GW Books was its own thing. It was even physically, I mean, its offices were in Brighton where Dave lived, and of course the design studio is in Nottingham, as it still is, but of course still in the that little cramped upstairs office suite over a row of shops, rather than the Warhammer world as we all know and love it these days.
Sure, yeah. I was curious actually as well, just about why you chose to go with a pseudonym for your work with GW Books. I mean, Kim Newman's suggested that everybody was doing it, so that's why he did it for Jackie Ogle. But is that what drove you to use the Sandy Mitchell name?
It was the agent I had at the time,
Right.
who don't recall her exact words, but she was quite suspicious of tie-in fiction, which was a relatively niche and part of publishing at the time. And I think maybe not her exact words, but the gist of it was, well, if you use your own name on this, I'll never be able to sell anything else you do.
Right.
So basically, right, okay, pseudonym. And of course, as it turned out, that was a terrible marketing decision for further in the future. Because Sandy outsells me by a huge amount. And in retrospect, I think the books I did for Bain would have sold a lot better if I'd used the Sandy name on them rather than my own.
It's fascinating how these things sort of turn around and work out, isn't it?
Yeah.
I believe that it was mentioned in White Dwarf that there was a novel that you were working on for Dark Future as well around that time.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I was, yes. Because, as I said, I was still trying to work my way into 40K. And Dark Future seemed like a more accessible science fiction property. And so I went ahead and did a fairly straight down the line, based very much on the rule books and the feel of the game. And by the time I turned it in, Kim had sort of picked up the ball and run with it and sort of taken it off in some very bizarre directions, and it didn't really mesh terribly well with the way that the whole property was developing. So it just didn't fit what had become the line anymore. So they just paid me a kill fee, and that was it, really.
Right.
I mean, in all honesty, it probably wasn't that good a book either. So because that would have been the first full length novel that I ever really tried to get going with. So I think probably I've never dared go back and look at it, to be honest.
Yeah, because that was Speed Kills, I think it was called, or at least that's what it was referred to in that White Dwarf article.
Yes.
Is that sat on a disc somewhere? Is that on a computer and it's just sort of never to see the light of day, or is it destroyed and gone?
It was on one of those old 3-inch Amstrad discs,
right?
And I think I remember it being transferred to a 3.5-inch floppy at some point. So it's probably on a hard drive or a thumb drive somewhere.
Right.
But my last but one computer sort of suffered a catastrophic hard drive failure, and I lost quite a lot of stuff in that. Yes. So memo to self, switch to Macs, and always use Time Machine.
Yes, that's good advice.
So, which I promptly did.
Right. So the GW Books era sort of came to an end relatively quickly in 91.
Yeah.
And that sort of experiment petered out a little bit, didn't it? And do you remember that time? What sort of how that felt going through all of that?
Well, I think as I remember it, basically there had been a management buyout that I'm not sure if Brian Ansell had retired or been pushed. but it depended on who you spoke to at the time. I remember talking to people from the studio, and some were like, "Oh, Brian's gone," and some were like, "It's like Romania after they shot Ceausescu." So, it kind of depends who you speak to, but GW Books was very much his baby, I think, and the new management team wanted to concentrate more on the core miniatures side of the business, because that was where most of the money was, and still is, I think.
Right.
Now Black Library is well enough established to be a core part of the business on its own, as a kind of, as I understand it, kind of a subsidiary division. But they're very good at what they do, and they're probably a bit more successful than some of the more smaller mainstream publishers in terms of sales, output, profitability. So it's a nice thing to be associated with.
Yeah. I mean, before we get into that sort of Black Library period, I was curious about that period between. So obviously you'd done that work with GW Books. You then continued a career. I mean, one thing I was very intrigued to discover was that you worked on Bugs for the BBC, right? That the TV show.
Yes.
I'm a big fan of Bugs. I loved that at the time.
Oh, great. Well, technically, I was working for Carnival Films, which
right
was the company that made Bugs for the BBC.
Right.
Okay, so going back a little, my agent, who'd not liked who had not liked the idea of doing tie-in fiction, got me a gig working on an SF show that Jed Mercurio produced, of Line of Duty fame back in the early days of his career,
right?
And as a script associate, and so basically I'd worked on that for a bit, sort of contributing, as part of the writers' room, and although as it ended up, Jed ended up rewriting everything, and so by the end of it, the scripts had his fingerprints all over it, and anyway, so that was a really interesting experience and quite fun to do. And off the back of that, and the fact that a couple of years before I'd done a novelisation for Virgin Books of a couple of the first season episodes of Bugs, also with Sandy,
right?
She got me an in with Carnival, because there'd been a bit of a hiatus between seasons 3 and 4, but the BBC had recommissioned it after a bit of a humming and hawing, and they decided that what they wanted to do with this one was try the American writers' room style of it. So they got in half a dozen writers, so we spent 9 months, basically, the first few months in the Carnival Films offices in London, literally in a writer's room, sort of breaking series arcs and individual story episodes. And then we would sort of go off and write bits of script. So I remember I was, I'd be working on like Act 1 of episode 3, and Colin would be working on Act 3 of the same episode, and Act 2, and sort of doing a final polish on episode 1, which had been stitched together at that point. And then after a while, we sort of went to we sort of kind of dispersed to remote working, so we weren't having to commute in so much, and we were assigned whole scripts to break once we'd got the outlines. So I think I'm credited as writer on a couple of the episodes, but a lot of those scripts that have me as sole or joint writer on actually have scenes, or in one case an entire act 3 that somebody else did. Because we'd got to the point where actually we can't afford to do this climax, let's do it different and cheaper. But by that time I was working on episode 7, which needed rewriting from the ground up, so somebody else took on the final polish of that. So basically that's why we're all credited as individual writers on some episodes of that series, and script executives on the others.
Right.
So that was a lot of fun to do.
I'll bet. Yeah, I mean, very and sort of of an era of almost peak Saturday night TV in the UK on the BBC, and had a lot of fingerprints of. It was tech savvy, and it was looking at the future of technology, quite prescient in many ways. And obviously a sort of a Hollywoodization of a lot of that kind of stuff, but quite fun and advanced for its time.
Yes, I mean, these days I think some of the tech looks quite engagingly retro, but
sure.
It was cutting edge at the time.
Yeah. Absolutely,
yes. It did kind of help that I was coming from an SF writer background rather than a thriller background, because some of the guys were coming up with stuff that was basically Star Trek technology, not plausible, next 5 years technology.
Sure.
Go, actually, no, that doesn't work. But it was enormous fun to do.
Brilliant, yeah. So then how did you go from that to then sort of finding yourself working with the Black Library and Games Workshop again?
Okay, I did a little bit more stuff for Carnival after Bugs ended. They brought me on to do the pilot script for a series idea that they had, but that didn't get picked up and they got dropped. And it turned out that what I'd been doing for them was considered very niche elsewhere. There were a couple of other TV things that nearly came off. One of the guys I'd worked with on Bugs was also one of the core writers on Doctors, and he'd been poached to go and be the new script editor on Family Affairs, which was the Channel 5 soap.
Cool.
And he sort of said, do me a pitch document for a couple of episodes of that, and then he phoned up and said they cancelled the show before I even got my desk. So so that was that. And also, to be honest about it, a large part of working successfully in television is networking, which means going to things and talking to people. And I'm autistic, so I find that really, really hard. And I'm actually much happier sitting in front of a keyboard and chatting to editors on Zoom and just going in for a very occasional consultations. So temperamentally, I'm much more of a novelist than a screenwriter, I think.
Right.
Although I would jump at the chance to do more screenwriting because I enjoy it so much when it's just me and the keyboard.
Sure.
The great thing about screenwriting is that, in a novel, you will spend like 3 pages sort of building up a tense sort of atmosphere of impending dread through very carefully chosen words and metaphors and images. And in a script, you just write, X old house, very spooky, night.
Sure.
And then you can just get onto the get back into the plot and the characters.
Yeah, brilliant. So was it really? Did you hear about Black Library and sort of went and pitched them, or did they reach out to you?
No, they got in touch,
right?
Which was nice.
Yeah.
Because one of the first things they did was to go through the old GW books back catalogue and pull out some stories that still stood up, and wanted to do a reprint anthology, which was quite smart because a lot of people still wanted to read those stories and couldn't get hold of them anywhere but charity shops. So they actually got in touch and said, do you mind if we reprint the Tylian Rat, and here's some money? And I went, yeah, no problem. And they said, do you want to picture some stuff? Because one of the things they had at the time was Inferno, which was their short story magazine. Back in the days when short stories were actually still printed on physical paper instead of pixels. And so I thought, yeah, okay. And I said, what we really want is some 40k stuff. And still remembering that I wasn't that keen on 40k to start with. I thought, yeah, okay. But I'd read some of the Gaunt's Ghosts things, and the world had developed a lot since then. And I thought, I could actually do this. And one of the things I'd always wanted to do was do a book, or a story at least, about a character who everyone thought was a hero but was a total fraud, sort of based pretty much on the Flashman books, which I'm a huge fan of. And I thought, well, the thing that always stopped me was that to make that credible, you have to do a lot of world building and create a world. But 40k, it was already there for me. It was the perfect setting for a character like that. So I pitched it, the first Ciaphas Cain short story, and they actually went, nope, no chance.
Right.
You can't do humour in 40k, and nobody's going to like a character who's out for themselves instead of, heroically sacrificing themselves for the Emperor. And I went, but the only way I could get him out of my head was to write this. I've already done it, so I might as well send it in. And they said, well, all right, we'll take a look at it, but I'm telling you now, we're not going to buy it. And then sort of 3 days later, it's, yes, this is brilliant, we're going to buy it. And then that was the first Cain short, Fight or Flight.
Right.
And then a few months later, it appeared in Inferno, and the reader feedback was incredible. And they said, do us another one. So I did another one, and same result. And they did, do us another one and pitch us a novel. Right. And I've basically been writing Cain ever since.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean that the Flashman papers. There's George MacDonald Fraser stories, aren't they? Where and it's it is that kind of idea. Is there? I mean, I think sort of my reading on Ciaphas Cain though is there's maybe a little bit more heroism to him than Flashman, perhaps.
Yes, I think Cain has Cain is more imposter syndrome than a genuine scoundrel.
Right.
I mean, yes, he's not an idiot. He's not going to throw his life away needlessly. He's not going to throw anybody else's life away needlessly. But he's got this idea in his head of what a commissar is supposed to be, and how far short he thinks he falls from that ideal. So he's very self-deprecating about himself in that regard.
Yeah.
And the irony is, of course, he doesn't realise just how amazingly good he is at his job because of that, because people follow him willingly instead of being coerced into doing it.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, because he is different to the typical commissar for exactly like you say, that precise reason. He actually thinks about his troops, and he doesn't want to send people to just get killed in ridiculous missions and stuff. So there is that aspect of actually caring about people, which not every commissar has, I imagine.
Yes. Yes, I mean, Jim Swallow once memorably described Cain as the anti-Gaunt, which I thought was a huge compliment.
That's fantastic. And then the other sort of influence that I sort of feel that may be in there, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but feels like there's a bit of Blackadder at
Oh,
work, maybe.
definitely. Definitely, yes. Yes, there's another friend of mine, John Lambshead, who's an excellent novelist, and you probably know as a games designer.
Right.
He did the Games Designer Handbook with Rick Priestley and 1 Hour Skirmish War Games, which is my absolute favorite free plug, my absolute favorite skirmish rule set. He sort of said that he identified with Cain because he was a reasonable man in an absolutely unreasonable universe. And I thought, yeah, actually, that kind of distills it for me. That kind of makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, very much
but
so.
Yeah, so there is that whole Blackadder thing of being the only person who can actually see with clarity what's going on around him, and he's surrounded by idiots and is a bit exasperated by them, but but what can you do?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean there are, and of course it's not just those two. Pretty much everything I write is just stuffed with pop culture allusions and influences, because that's just how I work, and it's actually quite true to the original spirit of the 40k universe, which was full of jokes and cultural references, which kind of fell by the wayside a bit as they leaned into the grimdark. But I think that is being reclaimed a bit now. I mean, you've got writers like Denny Flowers, who is also approaching the stuff with a bit of a lighter touch, and whose books I earnestly recommend you to go out and read if you haven't come across them already.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that because humor plays a really big part in the Cain stories, and some of that comes from just the sort of structural approach. So
Yeah.
you have Amberley Vale, the Inquisitor, who's sort of is telling the story, or at least curating the story from Cain's memoirs, and then including these footnotes throughout that kind of
Yes.
comment on, and there's this sort of meta conversation that's going on. I'm curious where that idea came from.
Well, that kind of was baked in from the start of the first novel, because I realised very early on that what made the short stories so successful was the first person narration. But if you're doing something at novel length, by definition, sort of Cain is in a much bigger situation. There's a lot more going on, most of which he would either be unaware of or simply not care about if he did. So bringing in an editorial voice who can sort of elucidate points in footnotes and stick in chunks of text from other sources, which gives you that wider perspective, kind of worked as a way of making Cain the character work in a wider context. Of course, as I got more of a handle on Amberley's personality and the sort of dynamic between the two of them, then, as you say, that kind of develops into a sort of conversation between them, and how they recall things differently.
Sure. Yes. One of my patrons actually was curious about whether or not some of those actually were editorial notes on the draft, so that you then sort of incorporated in a humorous way. Was that a thing ever?
No, I don't. Not that I recall.
Right.
Yeah, not that I recall. Not deliberately.
Sure.
But sort of quick shout out. I've been incredibly lucky with my editors at Black Library, which is something that tends to get overlooked. I mean, yes, the author is ultimately responsible for the book, but a good editor will make a book better, much, much better. And I've been really well served with the editors I've had, mostly Lindsay Priestley, who was an absolute legend in the Black Library circles, and then Kate Harmer and Will, who are who have carried the baton beautifully, and are incredibly supportive, and will do that thing of saying, "Are you sure this means what you think it means?" And why are they doing this exactly? Or my old favourite from the days of the Bug script, why doesn't he just shoot them?
Which I guess is a common problem in 40k fiction as well. Is that, why is it not just a gunfight?
Yeah. Yes. Why is he going to just stand there explaining his plan at length instead of just shooting him? So yes, editorial stuff input is very important.
Yeah.
But and of course I also got the Flashman books also have those his footnotes as well, which is half of which are actual historical footnotes and half of which Fraser made up completely to make the plot work.
Right. I suppose it's a nice device for giving you more leeway to do stuff like that as well. You can do world building through that as well.
Yeah. And the other thing, sort of Terry Pratchett once said to me, the great thing about footnotes is that you can shoehorn in all the jokes that didn't quite fit in the text.
Sure.
Yeah. Words I've taken very much to heart.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I mean, the just going back to that, the sort of Baldric and Blackadder connection, because we've got Cain as Blackadder. I mean, there's maybe not necessarily a Rowan Atkinson performance, but there's an element of the character. I think Jurgen very much Tony Robinson would make for a great performance. And then Miranda Richardson could potentially play Amberley Vale.
That's an idea.
Would have thought. But there was another question that my patrons were curious about, which was, given the sort of the references and the pop culture elements of your writing, have you ever thought about who would play these kind of characters if there was a film?
To be honest, no.
No.
No. I mean, my wife joked that Henry Cavill would make a really good Cain.
Right. Sure.
If he happens to be watching. But, that'd make her day. But no, I haven't really thought of them because I tend to sort of write for the character rather than I mean, even in a spec screenplay, I'm writing the character. I mean, it's different when you've got something that's cast, like when I was working on Bugs. I was writing with the tone of voice of the actors in mind, and I was kind of leaning into, Jesse would deliver that line really well,
because there are a lot of audiobooks of the Cain series, right? And they're really well performed. There's a real depth and richness to those performances. Do you listen to those? Do you sort of hear those voices when you're writing at all, or do you keep it very separate?
I haven't really listened to the audiobooks much because I can read much faster than I can listen.
Right.
But there were a couple that were written purely as audio dramas, and I think yes. I mean, I had not thought of Jurgen as sounding like Sean Bean, but it's so good that it just fits so well. I thought, yeah, that's good, that's great. Yes, but no, I haven't really thought of those voices as the voice of Cain because I kind of the voice I have in my head when I'm writing Cain is of this sort of elderly retired officer, sort of sitting in an armchair with a glass of anisec, sort of boring the pants off somebody with his. Let me tell you about the time I sort of, saw off the Eldar.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point, actually. Yeah, because obviously you have to straddle that line in a performance because it needs to live the moment as well as be a reflection back on the past, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean that's the thing that thought was really good that the way the actors will vary the voice between the narration, where he has a much older, sort of more jaded kind of timbre, and the young Cain who's in the moment.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah. So they've got some really talented people working on those.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There was another 40k series that you were working on a number of years back for Dark Heresy.
Oh, yes.
Which I believe was supposed to be a trilogy at one point, but only two books were released, right?
Yes, it was meant to be a trilogy. And I never got to finish it off. Basically, because at the time when it started, Black Library had a couple of subsidiaries. They had Black Flame, which was publishing sort of tie-ins for other IP that they were kind of franchising out, and they had Black Industry, which was their in-house RPG imprint, and that had released the second edition of Wolfrup, which was doing very well, and they then went on and did Dark Heresy, which was meant to be the first in a line of 40k role-playing games. And and so my remit was basically to do a trilogy of novels using what was supposed to be the sample characters, for pre-generated characters from the rulebook, who weren't in the rulebook when it was printed, because it was about a third over length and an awful lot of stuff was cut out.
Right.
So yeah, the six main characters in the book, in the ensemble cast, are all were all sort of given to me as pre-generated characters, and I had to kind of find a way of shoehorning them together, which was fun, and and sort of got me sort of working with characters I might not have come up with myself, and sort of drilling down into them and finding out what made them tick. So I really enjoyed doing that. But by the time the second one had hit print, the senior management had sort of taken a look at the books and gone, well, the amount of resources we're spending on printing RPGs, which we can franchise out to a specialized game publisher, we could be doing 3 more novels with those, in our release schedule with those, and they would make us more money. So you can't fault them for that logic. So by the time I turned in the outline for the third and final book, which tied everything up neatly, I hope, it was like, sorry, we've dropped the product line. So can you go and do another Cain book instead?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. Yeah. How those sort of business decisions can influence what's happening with the creative fiction, even down to, like you say, the business requirement for that series of books was to use the pre-generated characters. That provokes this interesting creative challenge, I suppose, like you say.
Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, I was really enjoying those books because it was, they were thematically and tonally different from the Cain books, but it was a universe that I was getting really quite familiar with. And I was still able to stuff it with pop culture jokes and references.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned them before, actually, the Blood on the Reich trilogy.
Yeah.
They were also, I'm right that they were also related to the Wolfrup second edition, right? They were sort of tangentially connected.
Sort of. Initially, the first one was supposed to tie into an MMORPG, an online one that they were licensing or developing. I'm not quite sure which.
Right.
And which was dropped.
Right.
At about the time I was pretty much nearing the end of the draft, and they're saying, "Oh, but we've got a new edition of Wolfrup now. So can you make it tie into that instead?" So there are a few bumps and swerves in there, which perhaps make it a less polished reading experience than the subsequent 2 novels, which probably is why they're the only books I've ever done for for Black Library that haven't turned out the advance.
Right. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
But which is a little disappointing in some ways because I dropped, but then I had fun bringing Sam back and in the second book, and and I got some little Easter eggs in for the old time GW books readers. There's a bit I was really proud of in Death's Legacy, which was the last one in the series, where Rudy, our protagonist, is doing some research for a witch hunter in the Forbidden Library of the Temple of Sigmar, and sort of turning over some dusty old manuscripts and goes, "Oh, there's a Detlef Sirk play here I've never heard of. Did anybody ever perform it?" And the witch hunter just goes, "Once. It's never been performed again."
Fantastic. I mean, I love those kind of references, and I think that it's just terrific fun because there's such a rich history there to explore, and like you say, it's almost an Easter egg and a little gift to long-time fans or people who have explored the world in that way.
Yeah.
Are you working on any new projects now? Is there anything sort of coming down the pike that you're able to talk about?
Well, yes, I'm doing it. I think I'm allowed to say that more Cain is coming.
Great.
Yes, there's not a lot else I can say at the moment, because but yes, there is stuff coming up. I think next year is the 25th anniversary of Cain. So yeah,
fantastic.
So this will be marked. Is all I can say.
Sure, there's definitely plenty to look forward to. Then that's amazing. Well, Alex, it has been really wonderful to talk, and I'm so grateful that you've been able to share some of those stories because an amazing career and just some incredible creations and some fantastic stuff. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been tremendous fun. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much to Alex for joining me to talk about his amazing career writing under the name Sandy Mitchell. It was a terrific conversation, and I just really enjoyed it. So much stuff that I enjoy and so many fascinating stories. So thank you. If you would like to support the work I do here on the channel, researching and documenting the history of Games Workshop and the tabletop, then you can do so via my Patreon. I've put a link down below. Go and check it out if you can. You'll get early and exclusive access to articles and content, and it is the only way I'm able to keep doing this work, so I hugely appreciate it. You can also listen to my interviews as a podcast. Just search for In Conversation with Jordan Sorcery wherever you get your pods. And of course, there's loads more interviews here on the Jordan Sorcery Pods channel, and behind the scenes stories about the creation of the games that we love over on my main channel, Jordan Sorcery. Thank you once again to Alex Stewart. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.